Hi folks, this is a book review of an important book called Trans by Helen Joyce. It is subtitled When Ideology Meets Reality. And I'm feeling pretty nervous because I'm going to talk about a subject that gets people all bent out of shape sometimes and can result in people getting their YouTube channel cancelled, and in some circumstances you lose your job. Crazy as that sounds, we seem to have arrived at a strange kind of tyranny in society that I've never heard of such a thing before. You know, this sort of negation of free speech, an unwillingness to engage in debate, fear of disagreeing, and I think that's to a large extent due to the way that trans activism has been done. I want to be very careful to preface this by saying that, look, I know people do suffer from gender dysphoria, and I have compassion for that, and I think allowances should be made to help them, to make them more comfortable. But where we have arrived is in society is way past that. And I could see that even before reading this book. I could see that in certain contexts, most notably in sport, women's sports in particular, where we see the infiltration of trans women, which are, by that I mean biological males, men, who are now trans women. And the physical differences between men and women are disregarded because the mantra is trans women are women. And of course it's totally unfair to all the other women in the competition, because unpopular as it might be to say this, men by and large are stronger and faster than women. That's not a point that's up for debate, it's just a biological fact. We have different muscle mass, we have different fat distribution, we have testosterone in our favour, and our pelvic structure is different. Historically speaking, in terms of evolution, we are the hunters, whereas the women are the caregivers who raise children. And our bodies reflect that. So it's just not fair to have biological males competing in women's sports. It's really not. Physical reality matters. But what we're being told over and over again is that it doesn't matter. Trans women are women. So really I'm just going to go over some of the themes in the book that were sort of particularly relevant to me. Just on that point, trans women are women. The book makes this point, like if you substitute the word women in there for something else and you say something like, trans rackles are rackles, what does that actually mean? What is that saying? Well, first of all, you have to know what a rackle is before you can know what a trans rackle is. So what's a rackle? Well, I just made it up. It's just a made up word. It doesn't mean anything. You see what I mean? So when you say trans women are women, you have to first have a definition of what a woman is before you can have a definition of a trans woman, you see? So you have to have, we already know what a woman is, you know, due to the sexual characteristics that distinguish a woman from a man, right? So then to say trans women are women, it makes no sense. It's circular reasoning, it's a cheat on language, and yet this is what we hear, and this is the reason why women's sports have been infiltrated, why women's single-sex bathrooms and changing rooms have been infiltrated by biological males. I want to just say men, but I'm not supposed to, so I'm saying biological males to try and keep most people on board. But really what I mean is by men. Because I don't believe that language should be misused in this way. It's very difficult for me to look at a biological male who identifies as transgender, as a trans woman, and say, oh, you're a woman. I can't do it. And it's got nothing to do with transphobia. It's got nothing to do with me wanting to put that person down in some way or be nasty to them. It's just to do with the fact that, look, I have a view of reality. That's my view of reality. You don't get to tell me how to view reality. I view reality in the way that I wish, in the way that I think is rational. And there's certainly a historical precedent for it. But people are running scared, so this is why everything has changed. So women can no longer enjoy the safety and the comfort of going into a bathroom or a changing room and having the confidence that you'll only have other women there, you know? You know, think of a changing room where you're getting completely undressed. I don't want to be crude, but you know, I don't want to see biological women in a male changing room. I don't. And I think the same is probably true. That's how most women would feel about men in there. Then there's the prison service. This is something I hadn't even thought about until I read the book. A man can now identify as a trans woman and get transferred from a male prison into a female one. So he can do easier time, and he can get up to an awful lot more mischief, as it were, because men are stronger than women. So that puts women prisoners in danger from men. And that's happening now because people can't seem to resist this thing. Everybody's frightened. Nobody wants to resist this thing. So changing rooms and bathrooms are lost. Sport is lost. Women's prisons are lost. All of it is unfair, but all of it is happening due to trans activism. Now where this gets particularly poignant for me, as someone who works with children, right, teenagers, it's coming, if it's not already here, where I'm supposed to acknowledge that a boy, I may have to call a boy a girl, or a girl a boy, depending on what their personal wishes are. And that's a real problem for me, because I just don't believe it. I think gender dysphoria is real, but I think you are still stuck with the body that you are stuck with. A boy is always a boy and a girl is always a girl. And yes, I know that surgery can be done to change the exterior appearance to some extent, but it doesn't really change your biological sex. And the whole surgery thing is, you know, this is also very difficult for me. And this is where it becomes a matter of serious conscience for me. Because, okay, I could decide, you know, to say to myself, you know what, I'm just going to keep my head down. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm going to call that boy a girl and call that girl a boy. I'm going to use the pronouns that they want. I'm just going to get through the day. I could do that. But here's the thing. If I encourage them along this path, I am now aware that I am encouraging them along a path that ends in life-changing surgery that is irreversible, and they're only in their teenage years. What did I know when I was a teenager? I was clueless. You know, when I think about being a 17-year-old and how I became a Christian and how clueless I was about that and how toxic it was for me, and the 2 decades it took me to get its claws out of my head, you know, fundamentalist Christianity. Yet, you know, when I was 17 I thought I was smart, but I wasn't. But how can I in good conscience encourage that teenager along a path when I know that this path heads towards surgery that they can never take back, surgery that will make them infertile? Think about that. Surgery that will make them infertile. And more than that, I'm also aware, according to this book, I hope I'm getting this right, that 75% of children who identify as the opposite gender outgrow their gender dysphoria eventually, as long as they are not encouraged in that opposite gender role. 75%, that's pretty high. I mean, surely it's the ideal outcome for that child to get comfortable in their own skin. That's the ideal, not surgery, you know. But we're not allowed to question it. We're not allowed to express doubts. We're only allowed to be positive to that child in that one direction. My head is just, I hardly know how to express it, what I'm feeling. Because it's so easy for someone to just go to the comments and say, you're transphobic, or someone to phone my employer and say, you're transphobic, or someone to contact YouTube and say, this guy's channel needs to be taken down, he's transphobic. None of that is true. None of that is true. This is a serious matter of conscience. And I'm seeing that, you know, what started, like I said at the beginning, what started as making allowances for people suffering gender dysphoria has ended up somewhere totally different, where we're rewriting language for everybody and we're trampling on women's rights. And it's just not fair. It's not fair at all. I'm pausing because I'm trying to organize my thoughts here. Yeah. And still on the subject of, you know, teenagers, particularly girls, I've learned that the group that seems to be the most susceptible to the influence of transgender ideology are teenage girls and college-age women. Not boys, girls, and not females at any age, specifically that age group. And it tends to happen sometimes in groups, which makes you think more of a social contagion rather than actual gender dysphoria, you see? But you're not allowed to question it. But if that were true, if all those cases were genuine gender dysphoria, then the unbalanced statistic makes no sense, because you would expect the same thing to be with the boys, and you would expect the same kind of numbers with other age groups as well. But we don't. It's teenage girls and college-age women. And that's really scary. And I guess the thing that's to blame is, well, this gets into a whole other thing, which is important to talk about too. What are the actual reasons, potential reasons, for people wanting to transition? Gender dysphoria, of course, right? That it could be legitimate. And gender dysphoria is a lifelong thing where you have never felt at home in your own skin with its sexual attributes. Where you've always been a girl who's always wanted to be a boy and vice versa. Right? That's gender dysphoria. I'm not disputing that that's a real thing. I don't know for a fact that it is, but I'm willing to concede that at the present time. But think about this. Think about these factors as well. Let's say you're a teenager, a girl, and you're friendless or near friendless, and coming straight out of, you know, COVID-19 lockdowns hasn't exactly helped, where a lot of people have been stuck indoors for months on end with nothing but the internet for company, right? So, you know, maybe you have trouble making friends. But if you identify as transgender, you have instant access to an internet subculture that will celebrate you, right? So there's that as a possible factor as to why people do this. Another one is homophobia. Take a girl, for instance, who's a lesbian. Could also be a boy who's gay, but girl who's a lesbian, but hasn't come to terms with that, hates the fact that they're a lesbian, wishes they were straight. Religion could even be a factor there as well. But thanks to the transgender ideology, You don't have to be a girl who is a lesbian. You can be a trans boy who is heterosexual. Because if you declare yourself to be the opposite gender, you're then straight. You see? It could be even to do with the parents of such a child, where the homophobia is there, and they would prefer to have a heterosexual trans boy rather than a lesbian daughter. They would prefer to have a son who's heterosexual rather than a daughter who is gay, or vice versa, right? So there's that. I think narcissism can also be a factor. Being trans in the current social climate gives you much more status than being a boring cisgender person, if you know what I mean, like me, right? So there's that. So there's all these factors, but we're not supposed to question a child or a teenager who declares themselves to be transgender. We just have to encourage them along that path. But the reality is there are detransitioners. There are people who end up in their early 20s. Say, I heard of a case of a woman who'd given herself a double mastectomy, thus the removal of the breasts, when she was in her teens. And she recalls how everybody celebrated it. Nobody said, "Do you know what you're doing? You want to be careful? Caution." Nobody said that. She went ahead with the operation, and in her early 20s, she sued the doctor that did it and was successful in suing the doctor. Because, people don't question it because they're afraid, and I can understand that in the current climate. If I were younger, I don't know that I would be as bold as to make this video. But as it is, I'm kind of at the tail end of my career, really. As someone approaching 50, with plenty of savings under my belt. I'm still enjoying working, but if that came crashing to a halt, it would not devastate me, put it that way. But, yeah. So, there's a kind of tyranny in the air, a strange kind of tyranny in the air. And it's all to do with the way that trans activism has gone about its business. Instead of trying to change the minds of the public, it seems to have, the way it's supposed to work is you change the minds of the public, and then when they're on your side, you then apply for changes to policy in the government. And that's how gay marriage came about. The public ended up supporting gay marriage, then those changes came into play. But the way the transgender ideologues have gone about it has been to force the policy changes by making the people higher up afraid to disagree, and then the public is expected to play catch up. So the policy changes happen, and men are now allowed into women's bathrooms, and you just better accept it. It's not a case of like women wanted this, women didn't want this. It's being forced upon them. So it's a kind of tyranny. It boggles me that this can happen in the present age. To give you kind of a weird counterexample, imagine you were working for a firm and suddenly the bosses, let's say the bosses are all Christians, and they said to you, "We require everybody who works for us to be a Christian, and as proof of that, all we need you to do is to say Jesus is Lord. Everybody who says that keeps their job. Anybody who refuses to say that will be fired." Bit of a strange example, but it's meant to be a strange example because it would never happen. Nobody would tolerate that kind of religious tyranny in the workplace. So why do we tolerate this kind of tyranny? How did this happen? And it happened because the activists were basically using every dirty trick in the book. That's how it looks. So this is a book. This book, Trans, I find it very balanced. It's got a few one-star reviews that are very vitriolic. It's got an overwhelming majority of 5-star reviews. I'm siding with the 5-star reviews. I thought it was brilliant and balanced. It was also compassionate towards people who are gender dysphoric, but it comes down pretty hard on trans activism, and that's what I've tried to address in this video. So if you care about the way civilization seems to be heading, please read this book. It's an important one. It's the second book that I have read on this sort of issue. The first one was Douglas Murray's The Madness of Crowds. I recommend that one too. Yeah, strange times we live in. Alright folks, take care.
The sky